day 3 of no power here in New York, and I didn't get the chance to make the video during the daylight hours, so you get the candlelight mood again. I wanted to talk about a specific topic today, something that came up that I thought was interesting with regards to the overall kind of bigger picture race conversation that's happening across the country, across the world. And I've said in other videos, and I feel pretty strongly about this view that at least it's a consideration that we need to take more seriously is the definition of racism, the different types of racism. Not to say that any of them are good; they're all bad. But there's value, true value, in like the literal sense from a logical perspective to accounting for the fact that there may be different types of racism. And again, when I say value, that means something that would help get to the end objective or goal better, quicker, more efficiently, more effectively, assuming the end objective goal is to try and minimize or eliminate racism. Probably minimize is the realistic expectation. And I've said before, like there's KKK level racism, like truly violent, hateful, dangerous racism in that regard. Then there's more implicit, institutional, systemic racism, which can be as damaging in some ways. Holds people down, holds people back. There's people with subconscious or to some extent conscious biases where they just don't feel as comfortable around certain races. Again, not to say any of those are good, but there's just different types. And if you want to address and treat them, I think there's value to addressing and treating them with that complexity and nuance. And I think there's potential downside, again, towards the end objective of lumping everybody together. So what do I mean by that? So let me talk a little bit about the example that came up today. We are out of power, so all we have is an iPad and a 6-year-old son, and it's an old iPad, which has some preloaded movies on there, one of which is the movie High School Musical, which, if you're not familiar with, it's a Disney movie from, I don't know, let's call it 10 or 15 years ago, and it's about, the star in the movie is Zac Efron, who's a white character, who at the time was, relatively young, kind of popular, kind of almost, I don't think he was in a boy band, but kind of like a boy band type character. And the premise of the movie is he's the star character. He is the star of the basketball team, like the best player on the basketball team. And he meets a girl, and she wants to, audition for the High School Musical. And he has a talent for that too, so he wants to do that, but he's a little bit torn, between basketball and the musical, and there's all sorts of stories that go into it. But the relevant part to me is, I think my wife actually said it to me as my son was watching it, like it's funny because he's not particularly tall, he's not particularly athletic looking, but in the movie, he's meant to be the star of the basketball team. And at one point, there's a scene where the whole team's talking to him, and they're like, "We can't win without you, you can't do the musical, we need you." And she was just kind of laughing at how that's funny because he's probably not the best basketball player, on the team. And there were a few black people on the team. Again, not to be racist, but typically, we see the MPA and the numbers. Black people, however you want to say it, they're typically better at basketball. Typically, on average, I guess I would say. I don't have the data to support that, but on average. So why is that relevant? Well, it made me start thinking like, that's an example of one of the types of racism we talk about, right? The idea that this movie was made and without really any question at all from most of society, most of the mainstream media, or most people in America for that matter, where there was this part cast and it was Zac Efron, kind of the young, good-looking, popular white kid who plays the star of the basketball team. And somebody might look at that and say, well, what's the big deal? Like, that's who we cast. Well, the big deal of it is that the idea, right, and I may be projecting this on some people, but I think it's true for a good chunk of us. You would say, well, what if you cast that same part to a 6'6" black kid who's, same age, talented actor, And it just feels a little bit more lifelike, because if you're looking to make the star basketball player, more likely than not, when you look across America, the best basketball players, the top players, from high school are black. The thing that makes it a problem is that the thought of that is probably absurd to a lot of people. The idea of making that same movie, literally, High School Musical, whenever they made it 15 years ago, and genuinely thinking like, hey, let's cast the lead part with a 6'6" black kid and make him the star basketball player. He's going to try out for the musical, etc. It almost probably seems absurd to some people. Like, well, no. Like, of course you do Zac Efron. That's how you do a movie like that. That's the perfect character for it. And I think that speaks to some of the implicit racism that exists in America today. It's not the KKK level, not necessarily. Some people might have both. But it's not that. It's not that blatant, violent, hateful racism. But it's just that perspective that is so off that it seems bizarre to think that you would cast a character that's probably more realistic and more fitting for a role. The thought that you would do that, a 6'6" black kid, is absurd. And the thought that it's obviously Zac Efron, like obviously, that makes perfect sense. The thought that that feels so right speaks to the racism, right? That is just the way that most of America, particularly white America, thinks. It's just natural. And the thought of changing that or disrupting it feels wrong. And, you say, well, what does that say to the average black kid in America, where that's just the norm? Like, they watch this movie potentially and think, like, that's funny. Zac Efron's the star basketball player. But that's America, right? That's how people think. It's got to be a white kid. It has to be a white kid who's the best player, who's the star, who we care about. The black kid just becomes a side character, regardless of how realistic it is. That's a negative message. Is it as bad as, the KKK and lynching people or killing people? No, probably not. But it's still part of that overall racism. So I come back to the point, well, why is that relevant? Why is it valuable to distinguish those two? Somebody might say, hey, racism is racism. It's all bad. Get rid of it. I don't necessarily disagree. But again, I think there's value in distinguishing. I think there is a percentage of Americans, right, white Americans even, where if the message to them was, listen, I don't necessarily think you're a violent KKK level, hateful racist. But let's be honest, the idea of this movie being made and the idea that obviously, without question, Zac Efron or somebody like that would be the lead character, and the thought of putting in, a 6'6" black kid, who's really good at basketball, who can actually, do all the things, is absurd. Like, you got to be honest. That's kind of a problem, right? That speaks to some issue there. I think if spoken in that way, you would connect with a lot more people. Now, I'm not trying to be idealistic and say that would save the world, and it's as simple as that. Just say it clearly. But there is something to it. There is something to trying to find the truth in the matter. And for some people, that is the truth. They don't recognize that they're racist. They don't even realize that Zac Efron's a problem. So if you can put it in terms that they understand and speak to them in a way in which they actually hear it, you might be that much more likely to make a difference. And somebody could say, well, why do I have to speak it a certain way? Why do I have to say it so they hear it? I get it. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem justified. But there's a reality to it. If the goal is to bring people together, right, and work as one society, you might have to do that to an extent. If you want those people to change their minds, you have to explain it to them in a way in which they will change it. Now, you could go the other way, and you could say we're bucketing all racism together and mostly together, and it's all a problem, and we're speaking about white supremacy, whether it be a KKK member or somebody that thinks Zac Efron should be the star of High School Musical. You could do that, and I couldn't say you're wrong. You may be right in the long run. It appears to me, though, obviously coming from a white male perspective, for what it's worth, which may not be much, it's not as effective. It still draws divide. It makes people more playing defense than offense of trying to fix and address and get better. So I just think there's something valuable about speaking to people in real, genuine, honest terms about what the actual issue is, as close to the truth as it possibly is. If there's somebody that's actually a KKK racist level person who thinks Zac Efron is the right part for that movie, then sure, call that out. But there's undoubtedly some people who just don't get it. They don't see that problem. They just don't think it's as big of an issue. And I'll give you a flip side of this that I think illustrates it as well. I've spoken to a lot of people that likely would feel like, of course, Zac Efron should be the star of the movie, who have issue with Hamilton, the movie Hamilton, or the play Hamilton, I should say. And their issue is, there was supposedly this rule or policy set that, white people didn't need to apply for certain roles. And people were put off by that, and that seems wrong. And how could you do that? And isn't that racist? But if you're trying, a couple things about that. If you're trying to course correct for an issue that exists, like we're talking about with High School Musical, and we can name hundreds, if not thousands, of other movies that fall very much in that category, you may have to do something like that. You may have to say, hey, I want this show to be casted with people of color. So we're going to make sure of that because they don't get enough representation. And in theory, that's not a bad thing, but people see it as such. You could even take it a step further to say when you're making a movie or any art in that way, and you want people to connect with it, you try and do it in their terms, right? You see this in all different ways. You can see it in religion, right? Easter is a good example. There's nothing within the Catholic religion from its roots that speaks to bunnies and eggs and all these different decorations and things like that. But these were things that were adopted over the years as Catholicism spread across the world to try and relate to specific cultures, to get them to adopt it and buy into it. You speak their language a bit. Right, so it's the same thing when it comes to something like Hamilton. If you want people of color, in this case, to care and understand about American history and who Alexander Hamilton was and the Revolutionary War and George Washington, etc., you speak to somewhat their language. And Hamilton is kind of an urban hip-hop take on American history. And in many ways, they're doing that, I would say, because they want it to mean something to people. So they're trying to present it in their language. It's a good thing. If you care about American history, if you think people should be more educated on it, this is an effective way to do that. So you shouldn't be offended by it. Just like in the Zac Efron movie, they're trying to appeal to a certain type of person who connects with Zac Efron in that story, and that makes people want to watch it. In Hamilton, it's the same thing. For people of color, minorities, a lot of black people, seeing American history portrayed that way speaks to them a little bit more. It's more in line with the culture that they may live in or something that they may value, and it just makes it work better for them. So it's very much the same thing. Now, again, you could say, well, if the Zac Efron thing is bad, then the Hamilton thing has to be bad. In theory, you could argue that, right? In theory, it would be great if it was a true meritocracy and it was just whoever was best suited and we didn't have to worry about that. But life is as it is right now, right? And there are racial disparities, there are issues. So I think a little bit more understanding, just as I put in all the beginning of these videos, that perspective versus truth, stepping back and trying to see that, trying to see it from the High School Musical perspective that, hey, if you're a white person, you may be taking for granted the fact that Zac Efron's the star of this movie. It may not make sense, and there may be black people or people of color who look at it and say, nope, there's another example of racism in America and favoring white culture. And vice versa, when you think about Hamilton, don't be so quick to just say, well, that's wrong and that's racist and that, why are they doing this and why are they making the play that way? Maybe that's their take on American history and that's how they want to contribute to it and speak to a certain group of people or a culture. So maybe not be so quick to think we all know the answers. Try and understand the nuance, try and understand the complexity, and try and speak to people on the actual terms and the objective truth of the situation. Don't bucket, don't simplify. Try and really address the issue that's there.